Right, I've discovered something interesting. If you fill a 50 ml medical syringe with this type of end on it, it's like a lower lock it's called, it sort of screws on for half a turn with grease, and then you take the grease nipple, this thing, out of here. When you inject grease through here, it fills the kind of inside around there with grease. When the wheel's on, there's some big roller bearings which run around here, which also need to be full of grease. I'm not quite sure how it works. Either you inject the grease and it sort of comes out and splishes round. I mean, I'm going to pack it all with grease anyway, but there isn't actually a bearing in there as far as I'm aware. It's like there's a grease seal to stop grease going all the way down here, presumably, that the axle comes through when you put your axle housing on. So I don't quite understand why you particularly need masses of grease inside there, but anyway, there's a grease nipple there, so I'm not going to argue with the people who designed it. Now what I found is, look, this jams in there quite well, see, and then you just squeeze away. Hang on, I need to swap hands. Let me say, just squeeze away. It's quite thick grease, but it will go. And eventually it comes out of here, at which point I'm going to stop. Take that out, and then I'm just going to put the old grease nipple back in there. It's probably all clogged with paint and God knows what anyway. It's probably easier to just do it like that, to be honest. So when the wheel goes on, this area needs to be greased, there's a bearing there, but this area needs to be clean, because you want the metal to kind of grip onto the metal. I don't think you actually want lubrication here. You've got the big Woodruff key type thing as well, but this is done up mega tight. This is like 200 foot-pounds, something like that end nut, and it's to force the metal, two pieces of metal, cones of metal if you like, together. So I don't think you actually want grease here, but you want grease in there and all around here. So that's why I've stopped injecting grease, basically, because I'm going to clean this up with carburetor cleaner. So I've been putting the backing plates on. Basically the backing plate goes on, it's held on with 4 bolts which come through that way. The bottom ones are longer because those arms which come across here will bolt to them, so I've just done the 2 top up ones up tightly. They go through this ring, you can see there. See, there's a bolt head, and the idea is the bolt head jams up against here so it doesn't turn when you do up the nut. And you can see it's interesting how the axle works. This ring shaped thing is designed, it's got a trap here, and basically any goo and grease collects here and doesn't drop onto the brake lining material here or the edge of the drum, which would wreck it. So it's sort of simple, but it works. Then when you put the drum on, the tapered part binds here. There's 2 cones jammed together, and there's like a Woodruff key type thing here, and then you do this nut up to something immense like 200 foot-pounds, and it's just metal on metal gripping. And then if you look inside the drum in a minute, you'll see there's a huge load of roller bearings which roll around this surface. So it's driven by this part, but the weight is taken on these roller bearings around here. So basically that part needs to be all greased, but this part actually needs to be clean, because you want the metal to kind of you know, be a tight fit. Not you don't want that to swivel, and you don't want that bit lubricated. So I'm going to look at the drum. You can see here's these sort of giant rollers around here, that all needs to be greased. But that bit in there, the cone part, if you can see there, the cone part, that is the bit that's the interference fit with the cone shaped tapered part of the end of the axle. So that bit there, down there, needs to be clean, and this bit up here needs to be greased. So I've packed those with grease. I've put the key in here, so we'll see if I can slide it on now. Obviously I've got to line up the keyway. I've marked here where the groove is for the key, just so it's easier to slide the whole thing on. The next thing is there's these fibre washers which go in the end of the axle before the nut goes on. I'm actually not going to use those at the moment because basically these drums are going to come on and off a couple of times yet, so I'll just put them on the very last time I do everything up. And I'm going to do these up tight, but not 200 foot-pounds again, because they're going to come off a couple of times before everything's finished. Okay, so there it is, done up reasonably tight. So the only thing left now is put the wheels back on so I can actually roll it around the workshop a bit. Right, I'm finally back to where I was about 5 or 6 weeks ago, where I was going to lift up the engine and do a trial fit to check that that spline went onto this spline here. This is temporary, this is just MIG welded on, that'll come off. And then if that was successful, I'd repeat the exercise with my specially made adapter, if you remember, and then loosely bolt it together, wedge the engine in place, and then think about making some engine mounts. And this is where I was about 6 weeks ago, when I realized that, if you remember, this has 10 splines, that has 6, this now has 6, and it also has the right gear ratio. So I went off into an axle rebuild, but I was going to have to do that anyway. It's just a bit sooner than I thought I would have to. So the next episode will be second attempt at mocking up the engine position. Now so far, let's get some light on this. So far, if you can see this, there, I've got the splines in about 1 centimetre into the universal joint female splined output from the gearbox. It's definitely in, and I've got I tried doing it attached to the chassis and then realised I need to rock this up and down and like that around just to get it lined up perfectly. So I've taken it off. I've got my chassis supported by this jack here. See, it's not actually attached. So my axle's free. One end is on rollers, the other end looks as if it's on rollers, but it's not. It's on this jack. And the reason for that is so that, get the light right, hang on, there. If I turn this wheel a little bit, see, I can get a little bit of rotation there to help it go in. So basically I've been sort of leaning on the axle, pushing it that way against the engine, which is resting on blocks and also supported by the engine crane, wiggling this wheel a little bit so the shaft moves like that, and I've got it in about 1 centimetre, and just by leaning on it and wiggling it, it won't really go any further. So I'm not going to force anything, but everything's smeared with tons of grease. I've put these little threaded rods through. They're smaller than the proper bolt holes, one there and one there, so the forces are equal. They're opposed to each other, and then I'm just going to do it up a bit, wiggle, 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 and then measure the gap and see if it's gone in a bit more. Right, I don't know if you can see this. I've just polished these. I've just smoothed these over and polished them, so they're more like the 10-spoke one that was removed from this, which didn't have any sharp edges. It was beveled here, so I've just copied that. To make sure no bits of metal go where they shouldn't, I've just blocked all this up. I don't want any fragments going in there. So I'll clean all this up now and try again. And yeah, to do that I used one of these. It's for sanding in very tight spaces, with a fine grit sander on it, and it's done a reasonably good job, so hopefully that'll fit better now. I coated it with oil from one of these little oil cans, and then in fact, if you can see, it just slid straight in, to be honest. There was obviously just some little burr or something there that was stopping it, so that's fine. What I am going to do is push it in all the way till it won't go any further, and then just measure the distance between here and here to make sure, hopefully, that this is just a few mil longer. I don't want to do up my adapter tight to find this is being rammed into the universal joint, like squishing everything. There should just be a little bit of extra movement, a bit of play. So if I've done my measurements correctly, that'll be okay, but I should just try that. Okay, this is 12.6 centimeters, and I can't do it with one hand, but if you measure the top of here to there, it's 12.6, and if you go underneath and do the same again, it's 12.6. So not only is this spaced the right distance, but the engine is at the right angle, because this is temporarily bolted in now, so they're lined up. So just leave everything alone. Now, this isn't very pretty, but the engine is wedged at just the right height to achieve that, and it's at a very slight angle down. But of course, remember, we haven't got our 31-inch tyres on here. These are 29s, so it will bring the back up, which will probably bring the engine back to completely level. This distance here is 8.8. If we go on the other side, it's also 8.8. So the engine's at in the right place that way. It's in the right place in terms of angle. This is temporarily bolted in. This distance is correct. So if I make engine mounts to basically line up with these here like this, there's a tiny bit of movement. You can see the holes are actually oval, just slightly. So I've got 2 or 3 millimeters of movement either way. Then I'm within tolerance, basically. So the next step is to leave this alone and not move anything at all, and think about how I'm going to make engine mounts. I need to think about it, but for here, bearing in mind this hose has got to come out here, I was actually keeping it simple. I'd have a bar. It doesn't go straight across, but it goes down at a slight V to here, and then back up to there, and then the engine mounts will be about here. They're just cut with little verticals here, with room to get a bolt in. That would seem to me to be probably the strongest and use the least amount of metal and do the job and leave the hoses free. I've got to make an engine mount here and here, so it's got to clear the underside of the engine, the pulleys and these 2 hoses. So I'm using this flooring foam. It's quite handy because you can cut it with scissors, and so I've just marked out where the key things are. I'll show you here. So now we've got the main crank pulley, radiator hose port there and there, and I know my edge beams are here because I've cut it to fit. Some box section here with a little piece coming over the top, down to here, up there, tidied up a bit here, but pretty simple. So I'll cut that out of the foam now and just check it fits and just check it clears everything. Right, well, hopefully you can see this there. So that will clear the pulley, it will clear gives you enough room to push the hoses on each side. And imagine this is made of box section, thick box section, and then I'm just going to weld little brackets on here, and then these will rest on them. Well, you can see I'll just tack that together, but you've just got room to put the hoses on. The engine mounts will just be pretty simple little boxes with a bolt poking straight up through, and then you just drop the engine down onto the bolts and do up the nuts. I need to explain what I've been doing here now. This is pretty much bolted in, this side. This one's pretty much bolted in. So you think, oh well, that's easy. Well no, of course it's not easy. The best technique for getting this all lined up and bolted in is bolt this on to the gearbox with the gasket. Put the top bolt through here so it holds the gasket over the bolt just hanging, and then this back axle, it really is useful having it on these trolleys, because I can basically wheel the whole axle in holding this crossbar, because you remember these plates bolt up, and then tip the nose down so the male spline that's sticking out the input shaft from the Banjo axle sort of goes in, and then you can get the end into the female spline of the universal joint, which will probably have dropped down a little bit, so it's sort of at that angle, down like that. Get the nose in, lift this up, so they're now all kind of parallel with each other, and you've lifted up the universal joint and you've lifted up the female spline. Jiggle it around and it'll slide in, now that I've smoothed off just the ends, and then just wheel the whole thing forward on the dollies, just go psh, and then slowly start bolting these up, but take it easy, because remember there's a whole engine hanging off this, so if the angle of your engine is too far down, you'll see a bigger gap at here than at the bottom, or the other way. So because I don't have these bolts in at that point, so the axle's free to move up and down a bit, because the chances are you've got your engine, although it's resting on blocks, you've probably got it at the wrong height or the wrong angle just slightly, so you don't want to be putting massive stresses on this as you tighten it up. So just do it up loose to begin with and just edge it in, and then if you can see your engine's at the wrong height, I've got it on the engine crane in case it collapses and falls down, so that's like tensioned, but I've actually got blocks under here, I've got a jack under there, and using the jack, and because the sump slopes just slightly, you can move the blocks back, forward, back a bit, like a wedge, till you get it absolutely the right angle, and then just put one bolt in each side, because the chances are the other bolts won't fit, because if the engine's too low, then this hole will be too low relative to the one in the frame, and if it's too high, you know, it just won't line up. So get one in, do it up just sort of finger tight, I would say, then use the jack to pivot. So now this is a pivot point, it's actually pivoting over these bolts, because this is done up again just sort of medium tight, and get your engine up down until this part, which is now fixed to the engine in effect, rotates up and down till you can get the bolts through the holes. And then once you've got the bolts through the holes, these are just finger tight, that's the height of your engine needs to be. So then get your wedges in. I sort of hammered them in that way so that when I took the tension off the jack, it didn't drop, it just stayed where it was. The jack's there still just for safety, so I've got two means of support, and I've still got the engine crane just tensioned slightly, so if something decides to collapse, the engine will still kind of stay where it is, hopefully. So now, of course, although the whole frame is on the dolly, the wheel dollies, you can't really move it around because basically it's fixed to the engine. You've got your frame bolted to the axle, and the axle's connected to solid to the gearbox, to the engine. So now that is, so there's no point trying to move this this way or that way, because that's how it's just going to be. As it turns out, because I did all that measuring at the start and planning, it fits, surprisingly. So I've got just nice there. You can have brackets that go down there that become engine mounts there. Bit tight here on my clutch. The clearance between this plate and the frame is literally 0.5 millimetre. So I may just have to trim that back just a few millimetres there. This clutch, I assume, kind of goes that way, so I can get a pin through it and a kind of Y-shaped bracket with a cable pulling it. So that's just doable. I may cut a little recess out there and plate it, I don't know yet. So what a slog, eh? So the next thing, before all these blocks, bits of wood and everything collapse, the next thing is to get an engine mount in, and the most important end is this end, because the weight of this end, it's not ideal, but it could be taken by that for now. Obviously I will put engine mounts in there, but the priority one is this one. Let's get that rigid, and then you've got a nice stable structure to work from. Another thing, before I forget to mention it, I went on one of the forums and asked around, and because I wasn't quite sure what lubricates the universal joint that's sitting in there, and then the splined male-female spline piece which is sitting in here, and you know, do you fill this with oil, do you fill it with grease, or do you rely on a bit of oil leaking from the diff into the tube? General advice was grease everything, so I've greased everything up to the max before I put it together, but there is actually a hole there which I've covered to stop any bits of crud going in, but there'll be a little plug there, and I'll use that syringe technique, the 50mm syringe, to just splurge a couple of 100 mils of grease into here so it's kind of half full, so it's sloshing around in it. That's the plan. And that's why I've got the gaskets. I used the gaskets that came with the gasket kit for these. It had a gasket here and here to just kind of keep all that in a bit. Okay, so you can see here I've got the highest quality bolts I can get into the similar quality captive nuts on both sides. So that's quite neat, so I just need to weld that in now. Okay, you can see we've got an engine in. I haven't completed all the welding, I've just done the welding at the top. Obviously there's welding underneath, which I'll do when at some point the engine's all going to be out and the whole frame's going to be upside down, because there'll be some more tubes and things to go underneath, some bracing tubes maybe. I can't fit any bracing tubes until I worked out where the radiator goes. I may run diagonals here and turn this into a K member type thing. So anyway, there's the engine mounts this side. This side I've done the keep it simple stupid method. I don't know if you can see there. This is just 5mm thick box section. I've only tacked it in. And the rear engine mounts just rest and bolt through. Kind of part of the plan is if I was in a head-on collision, even if the bolts broke or weren't in, it still can't actually move that way. It's got to kind of break free here. The only way this engine goes in is by dropping it down. So that's another feature there. So I'll weld all that up when the engine's out, because it'll just be a lot easier. But I'm pretty pleased with that. It took a lot of measuring to get right. So the next thing probably I'll attempt is the gear change linkage, which somehow has got to come down here with all sorts of universal joints and miss whatever exhaust I decide to have here, and then come across here. Also I'm going to need some bracing across the rear. This one's only temporary. A good place to put a big strut actually be across there, because then you could undo these bolts, you could still move the axle back off, and then lift the engine and gearbox and this adapter straight up and out if you needed to. The thing is to not rush into anything like that. I'm just going to give it some thought before I do anything. So yeah, next things, do something interesting. Feels like a bit of progress being made then. Gear change, lever, and get the radiator in and rough out where that's going to go, how the airflow is going to come through it. I'm thinking of some vents here, come in, radiator, and then out through millions of louvers. There will be a firewall here, but I may bring the firewall basically straight down like that, but I might bring the firewall round down like that with a sealing edge, and then I can have air coming in here. That's the cunning plan. I don't know if it's going to work or not. Anyway, we've now got, in theory, although this is on dollies, in theory I should be able to roll this around the garage now. I should probably put some oil in the diff, simply because I don't want to just keep forgetting. So buy some diff oil, note to self.